Hello, everyone. Welcome to another very special live episode of the Idea to Value podcast. I'm your host, Nick Skillicorn, and I'm thrilled to have with us today JeNae Johnson. She's the CEO of CTM Unlimited, and she's a noted diversity and equity expert around the world. JeNae, it's wonderful having you here today.
Nick, I'm so glad to be with you, and thank you for the invitation.
So for people who don't know about you and the type of work that you do, could you just give us a brief background as to where you got started and what you're doing now?
Yeah, so Nick, that background is not brief, but I will do my best to consolidate it down to just a few sound bites. So when people ask me what I do, I always say to them, I rescue geniuses. And that has been at the core of any work that I've done in the consulting world, but also I'm a speaker and have done some coaching and that kind of thing. But I do lead with the fundamental belief that everyone has genius within them. But a lot of times we have blind spots, right? We have things that maybe we're just not great at, and it blocks us from really maximizing our genius. And so that's my approach to consulting. That's my approach to leading our team. And currently, our company is focused on helping companies achieve workplace equity. And so this is one of those things where I work with very brilliant people who are brilliant in the business world. But this is a challenge that is beyond what their capacity or capability might be. And so we have an opportunity to really help them shift their cultures and also see some real sustainable change in terms of equity in the workplace.
And when you say there's companies that struggle with this sort of change, what exactly is it that's a problem at the moment? How would you describe that?
You know, Nick, it really varies across the board. I think there are some companies that they know that they need to even acknowledge that something needs to change, but they have not figured out how to do that. And they're looking for a comfortable way to do that. And, you know, my spoiler alert is that there's not really a comfortable way. But what I always say is that we will never change what we don't acknowledge. You will never heal what you don't acknowledge. And so if you don't actually tell the truth about what's happening in your organization, and even backing up a bit, sometimes they're not even willing to explore to find out what the truth is. And that exploration looks like surveys and having focus group discussions with their employees, and going through this process of really getting to the bottom of and root causing, okay, we know there's a challenge in our culture. We know we have issues with retention or representation or things like that, but we're not even really sure why. So I think a lot of companies are challenged with, okay, where do I even start? I think also in 2020, we saw around the world that there were so many CEOs who made these very bold statements about what we will do and what we're committed to. We're going to spend this much money and we're going to support these businesses and, you know, all these other things. And those statements are great, but I think some of them underestimated the level of effort that it really took and where their company was in terms of achieving that. So what happens is there's a statement up at the top, but then it trickles down to the organization, and the people who have to make good on that statement are kind of like, this is great, but I don't know what to do with this. I'm not sure where to start. So I think that's where a lot of our genius work has come in, because, you know, particularly if I think about some of our clients who are, you know, directors and VP of HR, they are overwhelmed right now because they're dealing with a remote workforce, they're dealing with COVID, they're dealing with all of the other implications that come along with the remote workforce and COVID, and some of them are dealing with layoffs and reorgs. So even if they have the best intentions of doing something about achieving equity in the workplace, they literally are like, if I had the time, I would. If I had the bandwidth, I would. But I just have these other urgent things that are pressing, and I'm not sure how to balance that and actually do something that's meaningful.
So there's a lot to unpack there, and I think maybe let's start at the core, which is what would be a problem in a company that they might not be aware of. I don't think anyone nowadays disagrees, especially the people who usually listen to me. I don't think anyone disagrees that diversity and inclusion is actually a positive thing that we should be working towards. So if everyone agrees with it, then what sort of problems actually still exist? Let's say subtle ones and maybe some more advanced ones that companies might be suffering from.
Yeah, so I think one of the ones that I've heard frequently that's a bit more subtle has been about promotion within the organization, and particularly in comparison when it comes to gender. So we've heard from a lot of women in, let's say, middle management roles who have sort of hit a ceiling and haven't really been given the growth opportunities as some of their male counterparts, according to what they're saying. Our approach is very data driven, so we don't want to come in and say, oh, we know what the problem is. It's more about asking the right questions to kind of get to the bottom of it. And so as we're asking those questions, that is a repeated narrative. And even some of their male counterparts have kind of, they have corroborated the story. They've said, yeah, female colleague X was working along with me at this particular site. There was an opportunity for promotion. I got it, but she's more qualified, and she was passed over for it. And there were explanations that were, I guess they passed the smell test, if you will. So it's, oh, we think that you're not quite a fit yet for leadership, or we think we need to do some more development, or we need to give you a special project to kind of have you be more proven. But the resounding effect of that was, hey, I don't know that that's actually true. And I don't know that you actually are taking a good look at the value that I bring. And I'm not sure if you are just selecting this other person because that is what you're used to doing. And so then to see that happen more than once. So think about that same woman. We've heard, hey, this has been happening to me for the last 5 years. This has been happening to me for the last 10 years. And even the position that I'm in, I had to fight to get to that position. So I think those are the things that could be subtle, because it kind of feels like there's no one, calling this woman in some derogatory term, or, there's no harassment. It's not that, but it's something like, hey, we just, we thought that this other guy was a better fit. And that does happen. I think I've also heard some heartbreaking and very shocking things that have happened to people in organizations that are blatant, right? And that their leadership had no idea that it was happening. So, for example, I was interviewing a senior leader at a large global oil and gas company. And she was talking about how several years ago, maybe in the early 2000s, she worked in a work camp in Algeria because she was on location there. And she was harassed by her male counterparts while she was out taking a walk, where they would take weapons that had scopes on them and actually point the weapon at her body so she could see the red dot kind of circulating her body. And turns out they were doing this to the handful of women who were in this work camp. They all worked for the same company. So it wasn't like, either way, it's not acceptable, right? But these are her coworkers, just to add insult to injury. But they thought it was amusing. And of course, it's terrifying for that woman. And they were only doing it to the women. And because of this special work assignment, and because of the hours they were working, and because of the location, there were less than 10% of the workforce there were women. Everyone else was a man. And to hear that happened in 2003, 2004, it's jarring, right? But their senior leadership had no idea that this was happening, right? It wasn't until finally enough women got tired of this happening that they filed a complaint, and something was done, but it wasn't as drastic as it should have been to really correct the culture, because it was almost like, okay, guys, we have to say something to you, but no one was fired, no one was demoted. It wasn't an appropriate response based on how traumatic that is to feel like someone is trying to shoot you and it's really your coworkers.
I think that's probably one of the most explicit examples that I've ever heard of. And then over the last couple of years, we've had very explicit other examples related to diversity and inclusion around the Me Too movement, around race equality sort of protests. And I think a lot of companies look at those and say, well, that's not something that we are sort of doing wrong. We can see the real racists and the sexists and the assaulters who are at fault at that. But obviously, our company's not that bad. But there's probably still, as you're describing it, some unconscious biases or other really unconscious activity that's happening there, which is still preventing this equality from existing. Yeah,
I think it's always interesting to me to work with corporate leaders who really do think that the problem is external. So if we think about, particularly in the US over the last 8 months or so, and there's been sort of this reckoning around race, which was really sparked by the killing of George Floyd and several others in a short period of time by the police. And then, this social unrest that happened as a result of it. And so up until that point, I really felt like corporations looked at racism in America as a policing problem or a poverty problem or even a policy problem, right? But in reality, they were just as culpable in terms of having some responsibility, but also enabling it. And so I think that's where there was this intersection, there was this point where they had to acknowledge, like, oh, not only are we a part of the problem, but we could have done something long ago to provide a solution, and we just didn't. So we've had, in psychology, it's called the bystander effect, where you think everyone else is going to do something about it, and then no one does anything in terms of intervening on someone else's behalf. And so I think it was really interesting because there were a lot of companies that had a lot of outreach, right? They were doing a lot of things externally. They were partnering with community organizations, and they're donating millions every year to all of these different social justice efforts and, things to really help the Black community, the brown community, all these other marginalized communities, right? But then internally, they were doing little to nothing. But they felt like the external outreach, hey, we're doing our part. We've donated money to this organization. We host a walk and a gala every year, and we raise these funds, and, we present them with a big cardboard check, and everything is good. And in the meantime, the same people that they were serving, quote unquote, externally, also worked inside of their company and were suffering in silence. And sometimes not even in silence, just suffering. But that was being ignored by and large. And so one of the challenges I have to all leaders is to, yes, continue to do the community outreach. I think that's really important. But your external efforts need to match your internal efforts. They need to be balanced. So you can't just, kind of take care of everyone else externally. Meanwhile, your internal employees are saying, okay, well, you're doing all this for these other people, but what about us? And you haven't even acknowledged that there are challenges that are exactly the same as the challenges you're trying to solve outside of the company.
So if I'm going to be playing devil's advocate, which I love to do, I think that the big question that comes up is why? Why should it be so important to have diversity as really a lived culture compared to a stated culture? Is there much sort of evidence behind benefit of having more diversity of thought, more inclusion? Does it lead to better collaboration? Does it lead to better performance?
Yeah, so Nick, we have to do this often. So it's a question that I'm used to asking or answering rather. And it's really around making the business case for diversity and inclusion, because we're still, in our work, we're still dealing with corporations that by nature are concerned with their bottom line. So we have to show that there is some kind of benefit. We want to always lead with, how do we set up any initiative to be able to track ROI so that we can see that there's a return on this investment if we do this? And it has to be more than just the right thing to do. So personally, of course, I believe it's the right thing to do, but it has to be more than that for a company to really see sustainable change. And so one of the things is, one, it is well documented about the success, productivity, and even higher revenues for companies that are intentional about diversity and inclusion, that really make it a part of their core values. And when you see diverse representation on their corporate boards, in their leadership teams, and in their workforce, they perform better than ones that don't. That data and statistics are out there and it's well documented. I think the other piece is there are companies that when they're looking at how to make decisions or even how to attract talent, there is such a case for making sure that there are diverse viewpoints, and you will never achieve that if everyone in the room looks the same. Like there's just going to be limitations to that. So there's studies about that. And then I think the third piece is, if you're thinking about right now versus the future, and we look at the talent pipelines, particularly for some of the technology companies, for some of the energy companies, for some of the other global companies across industries, there is a challenge in their talent pipeline. They have people who are retirement eligible, and they know in the next 10 years they're going to have to attract top talent to stay competitive. And so it is also well documented that the next generation is the most diverse generation that we've ever seen. So as they're entering the workforce, they actually care about the diversity of a company in terms of representation. They care about the inclusion. They look at the data. They look at how they score on these different matrices that show how diverse a company is or how inclusive they are. And they will make decisions to go elsewhere if they feel like that is not a company where it fosters belonging and it fosters inclusion. So what happens is these companies that right now may be very competitive, they will lose their competitive edge because they will not get the new talent that's coming out of, undergrad and graduate school, because those kind of things actually matter to them. So I think those items, just kind of thinking about making that business case and being able to share those references, it helps for leaders to kind of have some eye-opening examples to say, wow, okay, so we cannot change, but here's the risk if we don't.
I'm going to send you through some other research which you might find interesting as well. Okay. Obviously, my focus is around innovation and creativity. There are documented research studies on how the makeup of teams is affected by the amount of diversity in that team as well. So more teams with more variety in their diversity of thinking perform better on innovation tasks and are more successful at actually implementing innovation. So that's another sort of reason to go for it. And teams that haven't worked together for the last sort of consistently the last couple of years, if there's new blood coming into teams, that makes that team more creative as well. So they will outperform teams that have been together and gone with the same team structure through project after project, year after year.
Yeah, I believe that. But yes, looking forward to you sending that over to me.
So let's take the wording that we're using here as well and understand it a bit better. Is there a difference between talking about diversity and talking about equality or equity?
Yeah, so again, a question that I get a lot. And, for our focus, we really do focus on equity more than anything, because I fundamentally believe that diversity, even equality, but inclusion as well, are inputs to equity. And so if you really focus on equity as being the goal, then you will by default achieve diversity and inclusion. But just for definition's sake, when we look at diversity in companies, we're talking about the eye test, if you will. So if I line up all the pictures of all the people who work in your company, does everyone sort of look the same? Are they of similar, are they the same gender? Are they same religion? Are they same race? Do they have the same background? Are they from the same schools? Like, did you only recruit from these two universities? And so everyone kind of has the same alma mater. So that's diversity in saying, okay, well, we want to actually switch it up and make sure that we have, a representation, a cross section of people. But a lot of companies stop short there because inclusion is about, are each of these people equally valued in their input and their contribution to the company? Or are they just there to satisfy the eye test, to say we have a diverse workforce? So one of the more common examples or analogies that people use around diversity and inclusion is diversity is being invited to the dance and inclusion is being invited to dance once you get there. So a lot of times you can come to a party, but then you just kind of stand on the wall the whole time and watch everyone else have fun and no one pulls you into that party. So think about all the people who show up to work every day and, they were obviously invited to be there, they were hired, but no one makes an effort or their leaders don't make an effort to pull them in to actually dance and to take advantage of all the benefits of being a part of that party or that organization. Then when I talk about equity, there are two things. One, when you achieve an equitable workplace, there should be no statistical predictors around the success or trajectory of any person. So Nick, for example, if I look at you versus me, and right now, if we both work for the same company, there would be a statistical predictor that would typically say that you are going to go higher in that company than I will. Not because we have difference of qualifications, I could even be more qualified. It wouldn't matter, right? It would be simply because we look at historical data, that is what has happened when you compare a Black woman and a white man. So if you look at equity in an organization, let's fast forward to 10 years from now, we know that we've achieved it if there is no statistical predictor, that it could be either one of us. And it is based on talent, based on skill, and based on who's most qualified. I think the other piece around equity versus equality is an example that I use around, kids being injured. And just hang with me for a second, because I know it feels like, what are we talking about? So if you imagine that you're in a kindergarten classroom and you have a box of Band-Aids, right? And you have a bunch of kids that it was just a rough day at recess, for example, and everyone got injured to some degree. Someone fell, someone ran and tripped, maybe there was a fight, I don't know, kind of a rough elementary school, right? But this is the example that we use in the workplace. So if I'm the teacher and I have a box of Band-Aids and I see Nick and Nick has a scrape on his elbow, I give him a Band-Aid. Then I see Jane has a dislocated shoulder, I give her a Band-Aid. Then I see Johnny, and Johnny has a broken toe, and I give him a Band-Aid. Then I see Sue, and Sue has a laceration above her eye, and I give her a Band-Aid.
We've all got Band-Aids, so we're all equal, aren't we?
Equal, right? I gave everyone a Band-Aid, so now it's equal. However, I did not take into consideration the level of injury or where that person was starting in terms of what they needed to provide a real remedy. So a lot of times companies will focus on equality, but equity says, I will take into consideration that, yes, maybe Nick needed a Band-Aid, but maybe someone else needed stitches. Maybe someone else needed a cast and a sling and an orthopedic doctor, right? But if I just give them a Band-Aid, I can say, well, I gave everyone a Band-Aid, so everyone's equal. But the only person that it actually benefited was the person who actually needed a Band-Aid, not the people who needed more medical attention. So sort of an extreme example, but also a lot of times that's why companies get stuck with equality versus equity, because equity takes into account where people are starting and what they actually need to achieve a level of success.
So we've talked about the why. I think it's very clear, and naturally I agree with you. I'm a very big proponent for diversity of thinking, diversity of people in the workplace. The harder question, though, is how. So let's say a company wants to improve their sort of makeup of their staff, but also the allowance of different staff to perform at their highest level, as you'd say, to rescue their genius.
Yeah.
What sort of things can companies start doing, whether it's baby steps or big sort of immediate change that helps them move in the right direction?
Yes, I'll give you two examples. One is something we're actually doing right now. So as you know, in the month of February in the US is Black History Month. And so there are a lot of companies that made commitments on the US side last year to do something substantial for Black History Month. But of course, they probably also anticipated that COVID would be quote unquote over, and we know that that's not the case. So we're still in a very virtual world. And so there are a lot of companies that still have not planned to do anything that's celebratory of their Black employees or just of Black people. And so one of the things that we're doing with several of our clients is a project that we're calling Project Amplify, that allows them to amplify Black voices inside of their company. And it honestly is not very involved, but it has high impact because they're specifically seeking out a cross-section of employees who are Black, but they have all these different backgrounds. And these are employees that you don't typically hear from. And we are literally getting on Microsoft Teams and recording conversations sort of like the one that we're having. And then their internal communications team is doing the editing of those videos and sharing them across their internal platforms. So even though it's not a very involved project, it has high impact because one, other employees get to see like, wow, there's this person that I didn't even know about and that I'm now paying attention to. And two, those leaders are intentionally amplifying that Black voice. Now, does it fix the culture of the organization? No, but it is a substantial step, and it is something that is a relatively small investment in terms of time and even cost for high impact. And also video lives on forever. And some of the footage that we've gotten and the stories that have come out of this have been phenomenal. To the point where these communications teams, they're like, oh, we also want to use this for our newsletter, and we also want to feature this person over here. So mind you, it's starting to paint this picture, and our goal really is to show that the Black experience is a human experience, and that there is more that we have in common that versus our differences, honestly. So that's one example. I think the other thing is I always encourage companies to start with listening. Listening does not have to be a 20-page survey that goes out to your entire workforce. It doesn't have to be that. It could literally be within small teams or small groups. Like, we use a lot of interactive polling where you get instantaneous feedback while you're in a session. It could be facilitated discussions, or it could be brief surveys that are just attached onto something else that employees have to do. So one of the things that we recommend is like, hey, you have this compliance training that happens in your companies all the time that people have to take, and some of it is about safety and health, some of it is about harassment in the workplace, whatever the case is, and they have to click through and kind of go through these online modules. What if you added 3 questions at the end about how they felt about being in the organization? What if you added 3 questions at the end about inclusion and had them rate it on a scale of 1 to 5, right? You could start to gather more data, and it also will give you an indication of where to dig deeper. And it's really impactful to do it that way because, one, you are intentionally providing solutions to your organization based on what they've said that they need. So instead of you coming as the leader and saying, this is what we're going to do, we're going to send you to this training, and we're going to have this team of consultants come in, and this is the project. Instead, you're saying, hey, you tell us where the problems are. And that's impactful because it brings people along for the journey, but also it makes sure that you are making decisions based on actual data versus, what you think might be the right answer.
Now let's take one last question, and it's probably one of the harder ones. So I'd love to end on something challenging.
Yeah.
In certain companies, in certain industries, there is just a lack of diversity at the moment. So I, for example, might be working in an industry where there is not much female representation, especially at the higher levels, at the decision maker levels. So what's your view on proactively and preferentially bringing people into either just the company to increase the diversity and inclusiveness of the company, and especially into higher levels in the organization?
Yeah, so this is definitely a hard question, and it can be controversial depending on what your view is. So we actually have had some engagements with a company that's in the nuclear industry. And as you can imagine, not only are they in the nuclear industry, but they're based in the Midwest in the US. So they're in Wisconsin. So the industry itself is not diverse at all when you look at the industry. And then their sheer location is not very diverse if you look at just the town where they're located. And so they still want to do something about it, but they acknowledge the barriers. And so they're like, well, JeNae, we don't know what we can do because a lot of our employees feel like, well, it's the nuclear industry. Like, where are we going to find people? And so I think that that's valid. But what I've recommended to them is to start by looking at how can they bolster the diversity of their talent pipeline. Instead of placing and kind of pulling in someone from maybe one of the major metropolitan cities who is, a Black woman or a Hispanic man to come and take a representation position, which might be a fix for a short term, but it's not going to change the culture. And then what we also find is that when you do that in companies, people don't stay. Because if your culture is not inclusive already, then you're going to have a retention issue. No matter how high up they are, they will leave. And that again is well documented. And we've seen it actually, particularly I've seen it over the last year at Wells Fargo, where they've had just kind of a mass exodus in some of their Black female employees who are very high up in the company, and they've gone to work for competitors. So I think that there's probably good intent around, let's just get someone in and place them at this higher level so that when people go to our website, they can see that our board is diverse, so they can see that our executive leadership team is diverse. but that's not a sustainable solution. It's really not. And so for this nuclear company, what we're working with them on is figuring out how they can partner with historically Black universities, how they can partner with organizations that specifically cater to maybe these underrepresented groups across race, across gender, and then start those partnerships early. So, one of the things that I offered to them, I said, well, I went to Howard University, which is an HBCU, and I was never exposed to nuclear engineering. But had I been exposed to it, it might be an option, but I didn't even know that was a thing, right? Like, it wasn't something that was on my radar. So a lot of times it's not because you don't have qualified talent who can actually do the work and excel at it. It's because there was no exposure early on to even know that would be a career path. So, what I challenge them to do is figure out how can you start to affect change at that end of the talent pipeline versus bringing someone in at an executive level or appointing a chief diversity officer who's a person of color. That is less effective than really saying let's figure out our partnerships and start at high school and college and start to expose diverse people to this industry as a way to really kind of fix the problem, if you will.
We've got some great comments coming through, especially people understanding the nuclear industry, how that is. And it's not just a quick fix, it's about long-term performance. JeNae, it's been absolutely wonderful speaking with you. If people want to find out more about you and your work, what's the best place they can go to find out more?
Yeah, so I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, so you can find me JeNae Johnson. I want to say my LinkedIn, like if you go to linkedin.com/in, it's Genius Rescue. So if you put that in, you'll find me as well. You can also go to our website. It's ctmunlimited.com. And I can, in the comments, drop my email and, if people really want to connect. But, always you can message me on LinkedIn. You can go to our website, or you can just connect with me on LinkedIn and kind of follow what we're doing.
Perfect. JeNae, it's been absolutely wonderful speaking with you, and I look forward to speaking again with you soon.